Anyway, without further ado, Bob McNally.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I'm all set. Thanks so much, Ann. Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, that's a great introduction. I'm so glad and happy to be here. And not only with my former Band-Aid ambassador, Simon Yi, we played, if you Google Coalition of the Willing and Walter Reed Army Medical Center, you'll come up with a conference we played with Jeff Skunk Baxter from Steely Dan and Doobie Brothers. Now, I think you're in there. I'm behind him. You can't see my picture, but I'm in there with Deputy Secretary, later Deputy Secretary Dan Poneman. And this is just I know we're live in the public, and this is supposed to be, sensitive, but there's actually this secret cabal of bipartisan, nonpartisan energy experts who actually play together and rock and roll in D.C. It's a very secretive organization. And my last public performance, actually, the ambassador's still playing, was at a breast cancer fundraiser with another band, a mutual friend of ours, called Pink Noise. And our guest star was Secretary of State Tony Blinken, believe it or not, part of the secret cabal. Okay, so I am so happy to be here. And everyone's had a big lunch, and I hope the lunch is settled. I hope we're good, because we're going to get a little volatile here. I thought I would just spend a little while talking about kind of where I've made my life's work anyway, studying the global oil market and talking about volatility. Because the environment in which we are considering all these big issues of supply and demand and renewables and climate change and so forth, I mean, the context matters, the environment matters, and I think it's important to understand why we've entered this sort of period of unusual, I won't say unprecedented, you'll see in a minute, but unusual volatility and how long it's going to be around is, I think, really important. And then I'd like to talk about what I think will be the next big surprise in energy, which I think will bear and touch on some of the climate change discussion that we've been having here. And then, as always, I'm going to try and keep it semi-short so that we can get into Q&A and so forth. So without further ado, let's start with the history of the global oil market. So for my book, my research assistant and I developed a monthly crude oil price series going back to 1859. If you look around now, the only series going back to 1859 is BP, thankfully puts out this data for free, but it's annual average prices. Well, we went and dug up, and we have an annual, it's a monthly price series. And I make it available to free, by the way, for free. So researchers who want it, just email me or DM me, and I'm happy to send it to you. And so there it is. And I start here because I say, well, if I were to say to you, the oil price is volatile, some of you folks with years on you, like me, older than me, would say, my God, he's coming here to tell us that oil prices are volatile? Jesus, let's get on to climate change or something. We all know that. Oil prices have never been fully stable, and they're all very cyclical. It's also true, though, that you have not seen this type of volatility. The last 15 years of oil price volatility, we haven't seen in modern times. You just don't see oil prices nearly quintuple from 2003, 2004, $30 a barrel, to almost $150 a barrel in 2008 without a war in the Persian Gulf. Go back to the 70s and ask yourself, when has oil prices ever spiked without a war in the Persian Gulf? Answer, never. Until then. Nor do you suddenly see oil prices just collapse from $100 a barrel in the summer of 2014 to $45 a barrel in January of 2015, and then down to $26 a barrel a year later. And then, for a day anyway, in 2020, negative $37 a barrel, without at least a recession. Very unusual behavior. The amplitude of the range is unusual, and the causes of the volatility are unusual. So we have to understand this. And so to understand it, you have to look at history. I believe in order to know where you are and where you're going, you got to look at the history. I just love history. And so you say, okay, we're going to start with the Arab oil embargo, because we all know that nothing relevant or interesting could have possibly happened in the global oil market before the Arab oil embargo in 1973. That's where we all begin. Well, actually, I think to understand why crude oil prices have been so volatile and whether or not they will continue to be volatile, you have to actually look before 1973. And that's what this inlaid series does. I say, 1973 and the Arab oil embargo, fine. We all know about that. You got to go beforehand. And what this chart shows you is that the oil market transitions between eras, multi-decade periods of relative stability, never perfect stability, but relative stability, with cycles fairly contained, and then wild boom-bust price cycles, where the booms end always in recession. Not most of the time, not hyperbole, always. Not every recession is caused, not every, what do I want to say? Every oil price spike leads to a recession. Not all recessions are caused by oil price spikes, but every time you have an oil price spike, you have a recession. So at the top, you kill demand. And at the bottom, you force shut-in at the wellhead. That is what I mean by no kidding boom-bust oil prices. And this has been a feature of the oil market since the very beginning. Why? We're going to go through the economics very quickly. On the demand side, oil is a must-have commodity for which there are a few substitutes, scalable substitutes. We'll talk about electric vehicles in a little bit. On the supply side, as some of you know and analyze it, my new Twitter friend Robert Clark over there knows as well, oil investment is a long-lived kind of affair with heavy upfront capital expenditures and then low operating cost afterwards. So after you spent those fortunes finding, developing, producing that oil, you let her run. You don't. So demand and supply for oil are what we say inelastic or insensitive to price. You know, it's not like say wine or cigars or something. What would happen if Total Wine announced that all Cabernets are 75% off for next week? I mean, I know about you. I'd stay in Texas another week. I get a truck. I go to Total Wine. All right. So my demand will go up. But what would happen if gasoline prices, and this would be nice, of course, fell from $4, wherever it is, to $1.50 next week? Would you get in the car and say, honey, I'll be back. I'm just going to go to Austin and back because this is just awesome. This is, I've never. You wouldn't. And conversely, if oil prices go way up, are you going to say, that's it, I'm not going to work because this is crazy. I won't pay that. I won't pay the price to drive and work. You probably won't. After a while, you might carpool. You may cut some trips short. But when your demand and supply are inelastic to price, like when the oil price goes down and Ally Giller says, back off on that, we're not making the money I want to make. No, no, no. You sunk the capital. Your OPEX is low. You're going to run that well no matter what. You're not going to shut in. So whenever you have a commodity for which the supply and demand are so insensitive, when you have a little imbalance between supply and demand, you need big price swings to balance the market. Now, inventory can help you moderate that a bit, but inventory is neither infinite nor costless. So this problem we've forgotten about in modern times because it was managed for us. And that's where we get to our swing producers. So we get the beginning of the oil market, 1859, 1880s, and now it's about illumination, not by transportation, and we have this wild boom-bust price action. Mr. Rockefeller comes along. He's like, this is nuts. He's a refiner, not a producer. He says, we cannot turn rock oil into the new lighting fuel of the world with this kind of boom-bust oil price volatility. So he became history's first swing producer or market manager. And he did it by integrating the downstream, the refining, and then cutting deals with midstream, then pipelines and railroads. And he brought stability to the oil market and the oil price so that now folks could say, I'm doing this. I'm off of whale oil. I'm off of turpentine. I'm getting this stuff for illumination. Stably priced was extremely important to the development of the oil market. Even when Rockefeller was taken down in the early 1900s, Ida Tarbell, his nemesis, even she credited him with bringing stability to the market. Because the refiners would just tell the drillers, we're not taking your oil. So they forced discipline on the drillers. 1911, we break up Standard Oil. We can't have evil trust, captains of industry controlling the market, and so there was the antitrust era. So we busted up Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1911. What happened? Very important, and bear with me on the history because where we've been and what I'm going through matters for where we are and where we're going. So between 1911 and 1932, we had the last multi-decade period in the oil market. Back to boom bust. No control at all at the wellhead, and you had these terrifying things. Now, the other thing that happened was oil changed from being an illumination fuel, for which the government could almost care less, to becoming a transportation fuel, which the government cared a lot about. World War I was won on oil, et cetera. People were getting into cars. I mean, this was becoming very political, a strategic commodity. And you had this boom-bust oil prices. that were impossible not only for the industry to manage, but the governments. And here is where we have to get into sensitive things. In this conversation, I'm going to have to mention at least 2 of the 3 taboos for private conversation. Religion and politics, we're going to have to get in there. And I want to get into religion right now. Now, I'm from Connecticut. But I have family members who moved down here. I worked for President George W. Bush, love Texans, admire Texans. And I, like many of you, have probably asked myself, why did God put Texans, and Oklahomans for that matter, on earth? You know, start from the obvious, college football, we get all that. Barbecue, I'm not talking about the obvious stuff. I'm the bigger picture. And I believe Lord put Texans and Oklahomans on earth to limit the role of government in economic activity, to let the private sector flourish, and to find and produce oil and gas, because there are no better people on the planet at doing that. And that's one of the things I admire about them. So imagine my surprise as an analyst of the global oil market when, in response to this wild boom-bust oil price cycles, and now we're talking about a bust, by late 1920s, early 30s, we're finding oil all over the place. Oklahoma, Texas, Black Giant, everything. It's getting, oil's falling to pennies on the barrel, but it's a strategic commodity now. It's Texas, it's schools, it's municipalities, it's jobs. But their volatility is getting crazy. In response to the wild boom-bust oil prices of 2 decades, the Texans came along and said, we've got to put an end to this. And they invented the most heavy-handed government control of, I think, any economic activity known to man, called the Texas Railroad Commission. I want to recognize here, I have some old friends, and one is Jimmy Glotfelty, who was my Bush administration colleague, is now with the Public Utility Commission of Texas. So Jimmy, it's great to see you again. But Jimmy's colleagues in Austin got together, and to vanquish, well, first of all, let me just show you some pictures here. Here's the picture. First thing the governor does, Governor Ross Sterling, first thing he does is declares a state of emergency. Oil prices have gotten so low because of the flood of new oil that he declared a state of emergency for the first time since the Civil War, sent troops into the fields to prod East Texas drillers away from their wells, and then summoned the legislature and enacted prorationing laws, which basically enabled the Texas Railroad Commission, 3 gentlemen would get together in Austin, Texas every month, and they would issue a quota well by well, field by field, to the producers every month, and they'd meet again to make sure that oversupply and that price collapse never happened. Governor was concerned about it. You know, sometimes we've got to do what's not natural here. He was embarrassed by it. Indeed, Mao Zedong would have blushed at the heavy-handed intervention in the private market that the Texas Railroad Commission was practicing for 40 years. But they did. Oh, sorry, you saw the shameless plug. I think you're getting a free copy out front, right? And so I think. So now measuring the success. Let me just go back to this one here. Okay, Texas Railroad Commission brings us a period of stability. For 40 years, they were the OPEC. The founders of OPEC, a Venezuelan gentleman who was exiled in the 1950s in the United States, he couldn't believe it. He looked and he said, these guys are crazy. That is great. They get together once a month. They tell the drillers how much they can drill. They make sure that those imbalances in supply and demand that I talked about don't develop, so we don't get the price swings. So then he went back into government. There was a revolution. He started to form OPEC. He went to Saudi Arabia and said, you have got to see this. They went to Texas. They hired a guy, a staffer from the Texas Railroad Commission, and say, show us how you do this. This is wonderful. You get together and you just do your barrel counting, and then you just say you can only produce this much, and you don't get this wild proof. You can keep the price where you want it. This is glorious. The Texas Railroad Commission was by far the most successful supply manager in the history of the oil market. OPEC takes over early 1972, does about as good a job as the Texas Railroad Commission. So I'm going to, as we leave this point, final thing. So what I did is I took my monthly crude oil price series, and I looked at the ranges, the percent change in a given year, and I averaged that, and you see the eras, okay? So very quickly, boom bust, you had about a 53% volatility, crazy, crazy. Rockefeller comes in, crushes it in half. We bust up Rockefeller, back to boom bust, 2 decades. Texas Railroad Commission comes in, practicing communism, right? Gets it down to about 4%, okay? OPEC takes over. They tried to be as good as Texas. They tried. They failed to be as good as Texas. They were equal to about Rockefeller with their success. Here's where we are, folks, and that's where we're staying. That's it. And as we get into these bigger issues, it's really hard for the world to manage this kind of volatility. And that's why it impelled people like the Texans to have to resort to communism. I mean, it's really difficult. You cannot plan your defense. You cannot plan your central bank policy. You cannot plan for jets. You cannot plan for what car you want to purchase when you have wild volatility for the price of lifeblood of modern economy. You can't bake it. It's like trying to bake a cake on Space Mountain. You can't do it. And this volatility is one of the biggest underappreciated challenges, I think, in our energy system. Okay, now I'm going to make a quick point here. Very busy chart. I'm sorry. But it brings together the geopolitical aspect, okay? These bars here, the black bars, show you the oil disruptions due to wars and geopolitical events expressed in percent of total world production on the left vertical axis, okay? And the dashed line is the price of oil, and the red line is all important. Again, another very important consideration for where we are right now. The red line, also expressed in percent of global oil market production, is spare production capacity. Here's the political benefit of having a swing producer. When the swing producer orders the wells to throttle back, right, it creates something that normally doesn't exist in the oil industry, quickly producible capacity. Normally you don't do that. As we said before, you invest the money, you run that thing all out. You do a workover, you do repairs, fine, but you don't deliberately hold oil back unless you're a swing producer. And when you do that, you create spare production capacity. So when you have a war, that comes in handy. It's like an emergency supply of the lifeblood of modern civilization. So let's go and look here. The biggest oil disruption in percentage terms, which is what really matters, was actually the 1956 Suez Crisis, first Arab-Israeli war. Do we hear, more oil was disrupted then than at any time? Do we remember our president wearing a sweater and telling us in gas lines and having all kinds of problems back then? No. Why? Look at the spare production capacity. The United States and other major oil companies, about 20% was the United States, the rest was international, was holding in 1/3 of global oil production capacity to keep prices stable. What other business on earth has a manager that comes in and says, shut down by 1/3? Why? We got to keep prices stable. There's not enough demand. We did that for oil. So we don't care about the Suez Crisis. Another big war, 1967, another big war, another big disruption. Percentage terms, over 5%. We don't care about it. Why? Texas Railroad Commission had extra, said no problem, we got this covered. They just dialed up Texas. 1973, Arab oil embargo, we all talk about it. It unleashed mayhem. Why? Because in 1972, March to be exact, in what he called a damned historic occasion, the then chairman of the TRC, Texas Railroad Commission, basically abdicated the swing producer role, said produce every barrel. Texas spare production capacity basically just about disappeared, and OPEC took over. And whoever controls spare production capacity controls pricing in the market and controls the buffer you need if you get into a geopolitical disruption, which President Biden is finding out right now, because he's got an 8 million barrel a day problem with how much oil Russia exports. There's only 2.5 million barrels a day in spare. Okay? We're low on spare, and we're high on disruption. That is a disaster for the economy. And OPEC Plus isn't taking our calls. President calls Saudi Arabia and UAE and says, please produce more oil. They're like, I haven't seen you around the house lately. You're not doing much for me. So, okay. All right, now we're going to get to the next big surprises, and I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to Q&A. Next big surprise. So, as an analyst and a forecaster, I'm always interested in the next big surprise that's material, that'll upend our way of thinking about the oil market. And because I know that anybody's forecast, mine, anybody else's, the only thing we know for sure about anybody's forecast of oil is that it is wrong, because nobody can really forecast the price of oil. So what I do is I try to find out what the consensus thinks. The International Energy Agency's forecasts, for example, they are widely viewed. And everyone kind of says that's where things are going. And there tends to be a herding behavior. And so I always say to myself, what does the consensus think about oil? And because they're just as wrong as I am, where are they wrong? Because if I know where they are wrong, then I'll know where the herd's going to move and say, whoops, we thought things were going this way, it's going that way. Now, since the return of our third boom-bust era in 2008, roughly, every 5 years, we have a huge surprise that hits the market. The last three came on the supply side, and we're going to go through those here. And I'm going to depict them by showing you, again, how the consensus was surprised. And the first one is that this is sort of 03 to 08. We learned that it's really tough to increase oil supply fast, or in other words, the supply curve is really steep. This was the last time Matt Simmons' book came out, Twilight in the Desert. Chevron CEO was calling it the era of easy oil is over. This is when oil prices were quintupling. And these were forecasts of non-OPEC production, so production of oil outside of OPEC for each year by the International Energy Agency, which is, I don't pick on them, they're doing the best job they can, but they are the consensus, okay? And you can see they started, each color is a different year's forecast. So from 03, 04, 05, 06, 07, they started every year saying, wow, oil prices are 15% higher. We're going to get another 1.2 million barrels a day. And then I tracked the revisions. Whoops, it's 1.1. No, let's be 0.8. Shoot, 0.5. Wow, no new oil. Let's start again. 1.5. No, 1.2, 1.5. This, folks, is a picture of the world learning that the supply curve was steep. And that's the main reason we went from 30 to 150. Fast forward 5 years, because these surprises come about every 5 to 7 years. The next one was shale, U.S. shale. I didn't expect that one, I have to admit. Wow. And those are just forecasts from the Energy Information Administration, so the U.S. Department of Energy's analytical branch, on U.S. production growth. And that was a terrific surprise. The first surprise was kind of tough for consumers, but this one was great, okay? So fast forward 5 years, third biggest surprise, OPEC plus, Saudi Arabia is not going to swing under shale. You know, I mean, if you're sitting there in 2013, 2014, believe me, every forecast assumed oil prices would always be $100 a barrel, because we all know if anything happens for 3 years in a row, it becomes permanent, right? So everybody assumed it's $300 a barrel, but you're getting, shale was coming on at 1.5 million barrels a day, Canada, Brazil, Russia. So oil supply was growing at about 2 million barrels a day back then. Demand didn't grow that fast. So you say, well, how can oil prices stay stable if supply is growing almost twice as fast as demand? Oh, we know. The swing producer, Saudi Arabia mainly, like the Texas Railroad Commission, will do its job. Because remember that we had been hardwired to think it's sort of like a fire department. Your job is to come out and put out fires so that the whole city doesn't burn. So the nanosecond we see more supply develop, you have to cut production. There was a little twist, though, in 2014. Saudi Arabia said, no, we're done. Not unless Russia joins us. Russia said, niet, we're not going to join you. And then we went from $100 a barrel to do that descent that we talked about. And in like a Netflix series, the Russian and Saudi marriage, boy, has it been tumultuous. I mean, they're getting along now. They're having barbecues. They're inviting people over. But they were killing each other in 2020. To the point where we had the Texas Railroad Commission considering going back to quotas. In May of 2020, it got so bad. But now the Russians and the Saudis are getting along. It's okay now, and they're managing the market. So that was the last big surprise. So then comes the question, okay, Bob, good enough history. What is the next big surprise? What's the next thing that's going to completely upend our sense of how oil prices are formed, right? Because the first one caused a quintupling. The second one kept oil prices stable at about 100 for a little while. And the third one sent oil prices down to the bottom. Now, before I give you that, my lawyers and political advisors have advised me to make the following disclaimer. I am not an evil person who hates the environment, okay? Exhibit number 1, a picture from my Peace Corps days. I have lived a zero carbon footprint for 2 years. No electricity, no running water, no gasoline, bicycle, okay? Very plant-based kind of diet and so forth, very, very low carbon. I bought an early version of a hybrid. And I worked for President Bush on the National Energy Policy Development Group. Dr. Ann, sorry, can I call you Ann? Ann and her group went to ITER, the ITER fusion test reactor in France. We're talking about that. I walked us into that for President Bush. We had a residential solar energy tax credit in the president's plan. We did a hydrogen fuel initiative in the president's plan. By the way, I'll digress for a second. If you stay around long enough, these alternatives come around every 5 years. It was hydrogen, then came biofuels after I left, then electric vehicles. Hydrogen's coming back. I think we go around in circles. So I did all these things. And look, I'll just say it up front. the world is warming, and human influences are exerting a warming influence on the world. I recognize that. It is a problem that, if anything, my tribe, the Republicans, need to step up and do more about. Okay, so I get all that. So that's my disclaimer. Okay, let's go on to the fourth surprise. The transition ain't coming anytime soon. It is not, okay? It's the, you know, in energy, energy experts, and I know David Goldwyn's here, and I hope he will agree, we kind of, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you kind of got to laugh at the history of how officials, presidents, both parties, think it's so easy to make transitions in the short term. You know, I mean, President Nixon, oh, we're going to be oil import-free, energy independent by 1980. President Carter, we're not going to import a drop more of oil than we do this year in 1977. President Bush, you know, God bless him, I begged him, please don't, not him, but please don't say that hydrogen cars are going to be in every showroom by 2018. Don't. We did it, okay? President Biden, we can get rid of oil and gas and electricity. We'll outlaw it by 2035, no problem. Okay, there's actually a great Jon Stewart, the comedian. If you Google, he has a great little synopsis of all these crazy kind of predictions and things. And you don't see this in other areas of policy. Do you see a president of the United States saying, if we can do an Apollo project and build the atomic bomb, we can cure breast cancer? If we can send a man to the moon, we can bring peace to the Middle East. Do you see, and I have a plan that in 10 or 15 years is going to cure breast cancer, cure pancreatic cancer, cure AIDS, solve Middle East peace, or any other problem you want, violence in the schools, 40,000 a year traffic deaths, whatever your problem is. Do we see presidents getting up and saying that like they do with energy? No. Why don't we see them saying those things? Because we'd all love it if the president said, my God, he's got a plan to kill breast cancer. I want to vote for him. Why don't they do that? Because 4 minutes after they would say something like that, CNN and CNBC would have a bunch of doctors on with white coats saying, how dare the president, well, what has escaped the medical community that the president knows on how to cure breast cancer? How dare he raise expectations, et cetera, et cetera. So presidents don't do that. But with energy, for some reason, they wing it. Both parties. What's different about now? You've got trillions of dollars of capital and swaths of our young folks who are bought into an equally impractical, crazy kind of a timescale for energy transitions. Again, I said this morning, read Václav Smil. He'll tell you about energy transitions. They are rare, they are hard, and they're always driven by technological innovation, okay? If you think about history, from Moses to Harriet Tubman, so 5 millennia. If a human being wanted to go faster over land than he or she could walk, your option was a horse or maybe a camel or something else you domesticated. Okay? 5 millennia. Yet now we're going to the moon and we're driving cars and we're doing all this. Was that because of a peak horse policy or a government intervention? No. That was because, thank God, capitalistic economies, the UK and the United States, incentivized people to think of new technologies to solve human cravings. In case of oil, we were actually looking for illumination, not even transportation. And then we invented prime movers, right, the equipment that uses the energy to bring us miraculous motion, heat, and light. Okay, that's why. Government had absolutely nothing to do with it. Yet even so, it took decades to transition our economy when it was voluntary. There was no subsidized gas stations or tax credits for internal combustion engine vehicles, Henry Ford, none of that. It just happened, and even then they take decades to replace the capital stock that's been put in the old outgoing energy source. So when you see political figures saying, well, we got to get to net zero emissions, we basically have to cut our carbon emissions to zero by 2050 on a net basis and take, you know, Shell is being ordered to divest 45% by 2030 and we're going to ban cars, but it's impractical. Even if we should, even for the planet, even if you made you could try to construct a cost-benefit case that made sense. It's practically impossible. Now, look, again, it can be done technically. We could ban cars and force people to take, like I did in the Peace Corps in Senegal, West Africa for 2 years. But I don't think elected governments are going to do that. So the real interesting thing, though, is the consensus has decided not only that we should decarbonize, but we will. This is the real big difference for oil prices. This isn't just another silly projection, aspirational goal by some leader. This is actually trillions of dollars of capital being bet on this. And here are the oil price forecasts by the IEA. And you can see until 2019, they assume, which we saw in history, is that oil demand grows at about half the rate of GDP. So a world growing at 3% is going to have 1.5% oil demand growth. In a 100 million barrel a day market, that's about 1.5 million barrels a day. But after they got in a lot of trouble from the environmental community, they said, how dare you say that the world is going to continue growing? Because if we have that demand, then you're just going to encourage the supply. It's like bread comes to pigeons. You encourage them. If you got to stop encouraging them. And so they canceled, literally. They abolished this sort of business as usual forecast, right? And they said, okay, we're only going to assume a greener world where consumers or policies will become much stronger such that oil demand will stop growing with GDP growth. It'll decouple such that oil demand will peak by 2030, roughly. Some say 2035, some say 2025. Until recently, BP thought we were going to peak in 2019. So the world has decided to believe that not only should we get off of oil, we will this decade. And money is being bet. And again, let's hold on to that idea as we talk about what that means for prices. Okay. So when you say, okay, what is causing that oil demand decoupling? And it's always transportation. It's not industrial uses or anything else. It's transportation. Okay, so if we're going to get off of oil and transportation, that has to be from one of two reasons. One, consumers will voluntarily buy much more fuel-efficient cars. Cars get efficient every single year. They always have. Doesn't mean consumption goes down, but they do. But we'll have to have a much bigger increase in the rate of efficiencies. Okay, is that happening? Absolutely not. Even the International Energy Agency, which has adopted this wishful thinking of peak demand, even they say our data are showing consumers are going for SUVs. I'll show you what's happening in the United States shortly. There's no evidence that consumers are voluntarily flocking to more fuel-efficient cars at a higher rate that you would need to get off of oil. So then you say, well, okay, if consumers won't do it voluntarily, then the government will have to force them to do so. Because it's an emergency, like a war, and in a wartime, you have to ask the sacrifice, and you just compel your people to do it. So my company looks very carefully at the stringency of fuel economy policies. And I'm running out of time, so I'll have to just summarize. China, laughably weak. Good on paper, weak in practice. I could go on. United States, I rewrote the fuel economy rules and reformed them. They stopped costing lives because the old system was killing people. We were trading blood for oil. But they're less stringent at saving fuel. We made a trade-off where we decided to value blood more than fuel. It could be used to raise the price of cars and encourage fuel-efficient cars, but under President Biden and Obama, it's not. Laughable. Europe, okay, 15% of the global oil demand. Europe has stringent rules. Europe's rules will basically ban gasoline cars by the early 2030s. And they're even, some of them are talking about going faster. So then you have to ask yourself, will they really, though? I mean, that looks good on paper. But what evidence do we have that European leaders have the political will to impose those kind of costs, especially if the consumers aren't voluntarily wanting to do it? Remember, we had President Macron from France tried to put a little bit of a diesel tax up in 2018, climate tax on diesel. What did he get? He got the Yellow Vest protest, massive social unrest, and he had to cancel that tax. He put it back in place. And we track this around the world, actually. We'll go in a second here. I'm going to go to the U.S. So let me go real quickly. The United States gasoline market, largest in the world, roughly 9 million barrels a day, is the canary in the coal mine for the peak oil consensus. This is actual gasoline demand. These spaghetti lines coming off are forecasts. Look back in the 1980s. The EIA has been forecasted a peak and decline in gasoline demand, just like it is today. The world believes this. Why is the EIA saying gasoline demand is about to peak and decline in the United States? Well, because consumers are going to be buying more fuel-efficient cars, or the government will force them to. Oh, really? Well, what happened? What really happened was the consumers were responding to higher oil prices, which causes them to buy more fuel-efficient cars, not the policy. When the oil price fell, so to see this price falls in the mid-1980s, and by the way, Washington eased up on the CAFE policies, demand rose, okay? So since 2008, EIA has been telling everybody gasoline demand is about to collapse in the United States. Why? Well, the fuel economy regulations are really tough, and consumers, they're not going to want to buy these things. The evidence is all to the contrary, but they still keep on forecasting a peak and decline in demand. Why would they do that? Here's the recent forecast for EIA on the left. You see actual gasoline demand. That gray line is last year's forecast. The black line is this year's forecast. Notice they had to revise higher. But notice how they keep that downward slope. They're sticking to their story. Why? Because government officials are not supposed to forecast that political leaders are going to fail at their objectives. Here's the most important chart right here. The orange bar is the actual efficiency of cars Americans are buying. The top line there, dark blue, is gasoline prices, and then the gray line are paper cafe standards, fuel economy standards. Notice that how up till 2014, cars are becoming more efficient. People were voluntarily buying more fuel-efficient cars. What else was happening then? The price of gasoline was going up, okay? What happened after 2014 when the price of gasoline goes down? No improvement in the fuel economy of cars Americans are buying since 2014. You will not see this in the New York Times. You will not see it in the EIA. But if you're betting or exposed to oil prices in the next decade, you got to focus on stuff like this. And here are all the protests. I can go through that later. We track them one by one, country after country. My favorite one is this. The COP talks, the climate talks before the last ones, before Glasgow, were supposed to be held in Santiago, Chile. But they had to be moved at the last minute because of massive social unrest in Santiago, Chile. Why was there massive social unrest? Well, because of a 4% increase in subway fares due to higher oil prices that made it unsafe to hold the conference about making oil prices more expensive. Okay. And then now we have this winter stress test. Every government in Europe is subsidizing. They're dropping energy taxes. And even in this country here, you've got a situation where you got, talk about, the Texans going to communism. Well, now you got Democrats, progressive Democrats, are saying not only should we cut the gasoline tax, but some are starting to talk about paying shale producers to produce more oil. I mean, it's... All right, here's the why it matters chart. And this is highly technical, so I apologize for this. It may take a little while to unpack. This is what it means for oil prices, right? The consensus is oil prices are going to be $80 for the next decade. So plan around that, right? Some people will say, oh, it's going down to 35 because the transition is going to strand those assets. Yeah, there's stranded assets, all right. I just don't think they're where people think they are. This is the consensus view on the left. If you say, what does the world think production growth in the world is going to be next year on an annual basis? Roughly 500,000 barrels a day. All right, we don't really disagree on that. With Russia now, if we don't invest in Russia, that could go down, but let's just assume that's right. It's the thing on demand growth, it's the big one. If you believe the new wishful thinking consensus, then oil demand growth is going to be about 500,000 barrels a day, maybe 700,000 barrels a day. That is what the world believes. Every major bank, every major agency basically has bought into that, because if they don't, they would hear it from the green community, and their governments won't tolerate it. And if you believe that world, the market's balanced. $80, 80, 90, we're good, okay? Here's the world I think we're going into. And this is not unusual, by the way. That's just a normal world of oil demand growing with GDP growth at roughly the same rate, recognizing that actual policy and consumer preferences are not going in the direction of the green transition. They're just not. There's just no evidence of that. And if we agree that oil demand is only going to grow by 500,000 barrels a day, then guess what? I'll leave it with this. No government can suspend the rules of supply and demand. And the price enforces those rules. And the price will make sure that you cannot consume what you won't produce or are willing to draw out of inventory. And the price will ensure that market balances with a new boom phase. So even before Ukraine's just getting us there faster and we have a recession risk. Even before then, we are entering a multi-year boom phase in oil prices that will take us to the levels, as they always do, that cause or precipitate a recession. I was thinking later this decade until Mr. Putin decided to attack Ukraine. That is where we're headed, and that will roil everything from climate policy to our economy to national security. Again, you can't bake a cake on Space Mountain. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bob, so much. In case I forget, we do have these books for you, and you can't get them anywhere. You're sold out. So, one of the silver linings of our current situation, not a good one, but it's been good for your book business,
Sure
to say the least.
Yeah.
So you're not into predicting, right? That's what you told the lady on CNBC last night. But what would you tell us what you think is going to happen at the OPEC meeting tomorrow?
Oh, that's actually an easier one.
Okay.
I think they're going to stick with the plan. So OPEC Plus is the only constant we have now. And they made a plan, a hard-fought one, because they had a kerfluffle last summer, and they said, look, we're going to increase the quota by about 400. It'll go up to 430,000 barrels a day. Let's just stick to that plan, and I think they're going to right now. They have no interest in going faster. Russia wouldn't accept that, and the Saudis want to stay friends with Russia. UAE kicked up a fuss, but they got kicked some extra production quietly. So I think everyone's happy. I think it's going to be a short meeting, and that'll be the easier part. Yeah. So I would say no, just a 430,000 barrel a day quota increase tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
He said it here. Let's see what happens. All right. We have time for a few questions.
So, in my opinion, I'm just, it's obvious that demand's going to balance the market. Where do you, I know it's a hard number to stab at, but where do you think demand destruction starts kicking in?
Yeah. About $150 a barrel on an annual average.
Like
so
sustained for that
yeah,
down
for
the
an
curve.
annual average. So you'd have weekly or monthly prints above that. So the way it's a rule of thumb, when energy expenditures, a percent of GDP, get in around 5%, that's when the consumer starts to tap out and fall away. That's what we saw in, but we're getting more efficient every year. So it used to be $120 a barrel, but I think around about 150 annual average. At that point, the consumer's like, all right, I'm not liking this, and yeah.
So we go to 180 in 3 or 4 weeks. I mean,
3 or 4
on
weeks, I think
expiration, who knows? But
possibly.
you have to have the little curve
Yeah,
down, right?
yeah. We could see 180, 120 this summer, 150, and if anything, it's going to happen faster. Depends on how much Mr. Putin. I mean, Putin, he's only doing it with gas right now, but basically saying I'll only take rubles from my commodity exports is basically an embargo. And even Germany and Poland now are talking about getting off of Russian oil this year. So, we're still in escalation phase in this crisis. I remind folks, there's a difference between like 9/11. 9/11 was one awful day. But then the crisis sort of stabilized. And so the escalation phase or the initiation phase was over, and then you get into stabilization, and then you work your way out. This is more like Pearl Harbor, where, yeah, it was a terrible day, December 7th, but then we had the Philippines and Wake Island and Hong Kong and, everything else, where you had 6 months where we didn't even have the situation stabilized and the escalation was happening. And we're more like that. We're still in escalation phase with Mr. Putin. So as long as you threaten that 8 million barrels a day, oil prices have got to go higher until we start rationing consumption.
Thanks. Bob, fabulous talk. Quickly, do we need Keystone XL? Do we need that extra?
Absolutely. I mean, that's just not so. Of course. I mean, Canada's our near neighbor with enormous resources. The quality fits right into the refinery configuration and the growth. My God, how can we be a responsible and a respected ally to countries on the Eurasian landmass facing tyranny if we don't even treat our Canadian brothers and sisters well? So that's a nothing burger. I will say both parties took that one hostage, over the last 15 years. There's a lot of game playing there. I actually think the Obama administration was getting ready to do the right thing and to get it done, actually, to be honest and fair to my Democratic friends. But it got hyper-political, like Anwar, and no question. That was a terrible decision, and the president should reverse it right away.
Other questions? Yeah. In the back?
There's a lot of talking heads stating that OPEC's spare capacity isn't quite what they claim, even though it's shown in Lowe. Kind of what are your thoughts on that, aside from the rest of the situation? Do you think, you mentioned twilight in the desert. Do you think that's becoming a factor again?
I didn't hear the second part. The first part was about spare capacity. Just give me the second part again.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned twilight in the desert, and there are a lot of talking heads coming back talking about OPEC's spare capacity is not what they claim. I just wonder if you have any insight into what you think and what government thinks about that.
Yeah, real quick. So the big debate, we think there's about 2.5 million barrels a day of spare production capacity. That is almost all in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait now. The real big questions is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia tells the world they can produce at 12.2 million barrels a day. And by spare capacity, we mean MSC, so maximum sustainable capacity, meaning you're not damaging your fields, you're not surging. We went to negative spare capacity in World War II before the final offensives in 1944. If you look at the government data, we had negative spare. We surged our wells and damaged our wells to produce more aviation gasoline. So when we think of a spare, we mean not surging, stable, steady running rate. Saudis say we've got 2 million barrels a day. We're at 10.2. We can do 12.2. And in April of 2020, when they went to war with Russia, economic war, they went to 12 in a month. So we showed you we can do it. We carry that number on our books, but there's a lot of questions between 11 and 12 million barrels a day for Saudi Arabia. How much is that is surge? How sustainable that is? So, and what's more important was that the market thinks. I think most market participants tend to think the Saudis can't do more than 11. And if that's the case, then there's only 1 million barrels a day in Saudi. We give them credit for 12 million barrels a day, so 2 million barrels a day is spare, but it gets to be a gray area between 11 and 12. Then comes the question of UAE. UAE, according to our information, is now producing about 500,000 barrels a day more than it is telling the barrel counters in the official publications. So that lowers it even further. So while the IEA and others will say there's as much as 4 million barrels a day in spare, we think it's much closer to 2.5. And that's only 2.5% of the market, in a 100 million barrel a day market is way too low, especially when you have, even before Putin put 8 million barrels a day of risk in the world. So it's way too low. So when spare capacity evaporates, that's what's going to help cause the market to zoom. That's what happened in 1972 when the Texas Railroad Commission ran out of spare in peacetime. That's what happened to Saudi Arabia in 2008 when it ran out of spare capacity in peacetime. And that's what's going to happen in the next few years when these guys ran out of spare capacity in peacetime.
What does the environment of U.S. shale producers look like as they try to ramp up and use some advantages that they have to fill this gap and all the roadblocks that they're going to hit?
Yeah, tough this year. When I talk to my shale friends, labor. So everybody who's driving a truck for us in West Texas is in Amazon, and they're not coming back. And service companies, the cost of things that even if we wanted to, really tough to find the labor and the materials to get it done. Plus, they are shell-shocked. You know, everyone's saying, oh, the shale companies must be feeling like they got swagger now. Biden's calling them up saying, please, 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 got to put a rig up there. That's not what I get. The shale companies, just like OPEC Plus, are still traumatized by May of 2020. And then, for that matter, 2015. For them, again, the worst thing since 1859, the worst fear of an oil driller is a price bust. And OPEC Plus has been, again, like a Netflix series, hot and cold. And so that's, I think, and now with this oil price spike, there's a legitimate concern. By September, we could have gone to $150 a barrel, and we could be down at 30 by December, because the demand will get crushed in a recession. So the shale guys they don't like this price volatility. They're not trusting that we're out of the woods with these price busts, and they can't find labor and material to make it work. So I think for that reason, they're going to be really cautious. I mean, they're already growing. We have wellhead lower 48 crude going up by 700,000 barrels a day this year. Total liquids by 1.1. So they're doing a good job this year, but I don't know about increasing it. You know, longer term, I think you're going to have a couple things. The back of the curve, the futures curve, has to rise up. We got to get rid of this peak demand idea in the consensus. That's going to be the real game changer. When that shoe drops and those agencies are forced to revise their demand up, that's when I think the shale guys are going to come back, because they're going to say, okay, the risk of bust has gone away. Now everyone realizes we're not peaking anytime soon. They need us, and I think you'll see them come on, but it's going to be another year or two. Yep.
Yeah, so I was just curious, kind of a follow-up question there. What we've heard in the oil and gas industry lately is capital discipline, return your equity through the shareholder dividends. So earlier this morning, you said uncertainty delays long-cycle investments and increased short-cycle investments. So for this supply-demand curve, do you see all of this supply coming from shale and eliminating major capital projects?
Yeah, I think it was somebody else who must have said that. I don't recall me saying it increases, it certainly delays long cycle, but I'm not sure that I see a lot of short cycle coming on yet. No, as I said, that's the other community. So you have the shale oil CEOs who are traumatized by the last few years of price busts, and they're not convinced we're out of the woods. Even with oil going to 110, when that's a scary sign, because that means the next move is down here. The second thing are the investors. And you talk to them and say, look, my stock will go down if I add rigs, you know? Plus the mixed signals they're getting from Washington. I had one there's a House hearing last October, and the CEOs were dragged before the House, and the House Democrats are saying, how dare you, I see that you publicly announced you're adding a rig. That's a climate crime. That's like a crime in plain sight. You're adding to production of a product that is killing the planet. How dare you? I mean, that's amazing. I mean, you commit murder in broad daylight too? What's up with that? Then they would go home or their office, and the White House would call saying, could you guys put rigs out there as fast as you guys can? So so it's a political uncertainty. It's the investors saying not yet. And we're actually, our company, we're going to be tracking the leading investors, because when they flip, that's when I think the shale guys will be comfortable doing it. And I think you're going to see all forms, though. You're going to see short cycle and long cycle oil. I think what Guyana's doing. I think you're going to see offshore. I think shale is going to get looked at outside the United States. When the world realizes how structurally short we are, I think you're going to see investment across the world, you know, in all cycles increase.
All right, I think that brings us to the moment that you've got to catch a plane.
Yep.
But I do want to say thanks for being so thought-provoking, giving us a glimpse of the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hope that was all right.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. All right.